St Pancras has a complex history. These days it's perhaps the most distinctive station in London, despite a lot of competition. It's been threatened with destruction many times, yet it always seems to cheat fate. Let's take a deep dive into the history of this most majestic of London's termini. It all started with a company called the Midland Railway. This company was formed in 1844 from an amalgamation of different railway companies in, yes, the Midlands. This was the era when the British railway network started coming together. Masterminding the amalgamation was George Hudson, whose legacy is, shall we say, mixed. He was an entrepreneur and Member of Parliament responsible for the creation of an enormous amount of the British railway network. He was also a fraudster whose financial dealings were rather reminiscent of the old cup and ball trick. His downfall came in 1849 and John Ellis took over as chairman. The Midland Railway seemingly had it all. They served a large territory with a lot of industry, particularly coal. One thing they didn't have was a connection to London, one of the biggest markets for basically everything. Initially they struck a deal with the London and North Western Railway, who had the line into Euston, to get to London over their metals. Then the Great Northern Railway opened their station at King's Cross, and from 1858 the Midland started sending their trains that way. Now, there were a few problems with this. Firstly, while the Great Northern was a quicker route, they charged a fortune to send coal over their lines, so the LNWR still got most of that traffic. And secondly, the Great Northern were not, shall we say, a good landlord. Whenever the Great Northern had to lay extra trains on, they took priority over the Midland. They seemed to have this weird relationship where they seemingly wanted to make life as difficult as possible for the Midland, but also didn't want to outright drive them out. The Great Northern wanted to strike a balance, don't allow the Midland to grow its traffic too much, but also remain friendly enough that they'd stay where the Great Northern could keep an eye on them. At this time they were already in competition with the London and North Western Railway, so perhaps it's understandable that they wanted to keep another rival in check. Since coal was the Midland's main purpose in getting to London, the Great Northern offered to keep them sweet by letting them build their own goods depot in Agar town between King's Cross and Euston. This opened in stages, the first in 1862 and the last in 1865. And that might have been enough to keep the Midland on side for a good long while, but in 1862 the Great Northern pushed them too far. That year was the Great International Exhibition, when both companies had a lot of extra trains on to meet the demand. Midland trains were shunted to one side to allow GNR trains priority. Even then, there wasn't enough space in King's Cross Station to handle it all. The Great Northern's answer was to send the Midland trains to King's Cross Goods Depot. These days, that's Coaldrop's Yard, and it's rather nice, but back then it was frankly embarrassing for the Midland to have to disembark passengers there among the coal carts and potato sacks. The final straw came when the Great Northern shunted the Midland's wagons out of King's Cross Yard to make space. The Midland responded by doing exactly what the Great Northern hoped they wouldn't, and attained permission in 1863 to build their own railway to London and their own station. A passenger station. And thanks to the existence of the new goods depot, the best place to put it was right next door to King's Cross. It's all rather ironic, really. The station would be named after the parish in which it sat, St Pancras. Pancras of Rome was said to have been martyred at the age of 14, and he was a popular object of veneration in England from the 6th century onwards, if you were wondering where the name came from. The new station would not only take its name from St Pancras, but also a portion of its land. St Pancras Old Church was standing in the way of progress, or rather, its graveyard was. As part of the scheme, the Midland Railway wanted to build a connection to the Metropolitan Railway, the first underground line, which opened in 1863. The best approach route was through the graveyard. Now, St Pancras Old Church was indeed an old church. Legend has it that it dates back to the Roman era, but physical evidence is less certain about that. Nevertheless, it is very old, and by the mid-19th century its graveyard was crowded. Parliament granted permission to dig part of it up on condition that the dead were respected. Which they weren't. Not in the initial digs, at least. Bones were disinterred without even a token attempt at reverence. There are stories of bits of bodies scattered everywhere and children playing with human remains. It became a scandal, with the newspapers reporting on open coffins in plain sight. The vicar complained to the Bishop of London. There weren't many people capable of humbling a Victorian railway director, but it turns out that God was one of them, and so further works were carried out with greater respect. And who better to oversee the works than Arthur Blomfield, an architect who happened to be the son of the Bishop of London. He had hoardings erected where work was taking place, so no more kids sneaking in and playing skull football. And he had a habit of dropping in unexpectedly to inspect proceedings. He also employed a young assistant, a sensitive soul from the West Country named Thomas Hardy. He's now best known as a novelist and poet. More than one biographer has speculated that his job may have had some influence on his later, often quite gloomy work. Well, perhaps. The bones were reinterred elsewhere, mostly at the large cemeteries of Highgate and Kensal Green. Among the graves was that of 18th century feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. According to legend, her daughter Mary had consummated her relationship with Percy Shelley on top of said grave. Other removed tombstones were arranged around an ash tree, which became known as the Hardy tree. This remained as a symbol of, well, various things until it fell in December of 2022. Suffice it to say that the Gothic credentials of St Pancras Station were established long before the architecture was planned out. But as the historian Frederick Miller pungently noted in his 1874 history of the area, the railway is no respecter of persons living or dead. It wasn't just the deceased that had to make way for the railway. To reach Euston Road, the line would have to plough through Agar town. Now, this tends to be characterised as a very poor area, a slum, really. Building a railway through it would surely have been doing London a service. The reality was more complicated than that. Yes, it was a poor area, but it was far from the worst in London. Many of the residents were labourers and craftsmen. Housing was not exactly luxurious, but nor was it as cramped and unsanitary as contemporary accounts often portray it. A suspicious person might suggest that it served the railway's interest if the general public thought it was an irredeemable sinkhole of vice and poverty. An optimist might have seen the railway as a form of slum clearance. In fact, it was the opposite. The railway was under no obligation to rehouse those it displaced, and consequently those residents ended up relocating nearby. And that influx of people into an already poor and crowded locality did worsen conditions for residents. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Euston Road marked the boundary of the station site for legal reasons. The Royal Commission on Metropolitan Railway Termini was set up in 1846 over concerns that these new railways would end up carving the city up if not checked. They set out a boundary in central London into which new railways were forbidden to intrude. These rules would later seemingly be relaxed, but too late for the Midland Railway. This is why King's Cross, St Pancras, Euston, Baker Street and Marylebone are in a long line, and it's also why the Metropolitan Railway was built, to connect the termini. While St Pancras did have a connection to the Met, there was no underground station here. Yet. The need to cross the Regent's Canal meant that the line had to be raised, which is why the trains at St Pancras are upstairs, while those at King's Cross are at ground level. The Midland Railway could literally look down on its neighbours. The next question was what to do with the space under the station. The engineer William Barlow originally intended to just fill it with soil. James Allport, the general manager, had a better idea. One of the places the Midland served was Burton-on-Trent. Due to the quality of its water, this was the beer capital of England. In fact, the water itself was often exported to enable other brewers to Burtonise their beverages, but that's another story. London consumed a lot of beer. Well, it still does, even at London pub prices. Beer, it seemed, could be as lucrative for the railway as coal. and so Allport proposed building a beer cellar under the station. Barlow agreed and set to work. The cellar was based on the layout of Burton storehouses, with 720 thin iron columns spaced according to the measurements of 3 hogsheads of beer. And all of this led Barlow to come up with something that would become the engineering marvel of the age. Originally, he imagined the train shed to consist of 2 spans, like other stations we could name. But that would mean putting in substantial foundation columns right in the middle of Allport's lovely new beer cellar. Barlow looked at his designs for the station floor and realised that he could be rather daring with his design. He approached Allport with a new proposal: a single-span roof, the widest in the world. The girders that supported the upper deck could also be used to tie the 2 sides of the roof together. Not only would this maximise space in the cellars, but it would give the company more freedom to do what they wanted under the shed. If they needed to rearrange the tracks or the platforms, they could, without having to account for pesky walls. Allport liked the way Barlow thought, especially when he suggested that it would be cheaper than a double span. And so it was authorised. So the original station was a double-decker. Up above, passenger trains. Down below, goods wagons would be brought in via a hydraulic lift and shunted around using capstans. There was no question of using locomotives or horses in such a cramped space. The biggest customer would be the Bass Brewery. In fact, Michael Thomas Bass was not only the head of the brewery, but he would become a major shareholder in and a director of the Midland Railway. He would also play a key role in the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants, an early union. A railway director setting up a union sounds like turkeys voting for Christmas, but what do I know? When the roof was completed, it was a truly magnificent structure. 689 feet long, 240 feet wide, and 100 feet tall at its highest point, or in new money, 210 metres long, 73 wide, and 30.5 tall. Unfortunately, Allport was not entirely happy with the decision to paint it brown. It would later be repainted sky blue to make it look more airy. The Midland were so keen to get their station into service that they didn't even wait to finish it. The first train steamed in on the 1st of October 1868, when the station was nowhere near complete. Which seems ironic, given the fuss they'd made about inadequate facilities when they used King's Cross. But there was a reason for this, beyond simple impatience. In 1866, the bank of Overend Gurney and Company collapsed. This led to a financial downturn that affected a lot of railway schemes. The Midland was forced to slow down construction. And inadequate facilities or not, they needed to make money. Even if the booking office wasn't complete, they still had to sell tickets. The roof is an impressive achievement, but it's perhaps overshadowed in public consciousness by the mighty Gothic frontage. However, when the station opened, that was basically a hole in the ground at the front of the train shed. The frontage housed the Midland Grand Hotel. Hotels at railway termini were a standard feature, and often it was an opportunity for companies to show off. For the Midland Railway, showing off was almost an existential thing. As the Great Northern Railway had feared, the completion of the Midland's London extension meant that there were now 3 main-line routes between London and the great cities of Scotland. But the Midland certainly couldn't compete on speed. The route was hilly and the trains were heavy. So Allport introduced a policy that if their service couldn't be the fastest, it would be the best in other ways. Third-class coaches would be attached to express trains. Before that, third-class passengers would have to travel by slower, stopping services. The Midland Railway got the first Pullman coaches in Britain, an innovation Allport had encountered in America. This gave a new meaning to first class. Pullman cars were elaborately decorated and well furnished, with novel features like carriage heating and, to everyone's relief, toilets. In 1875, the Midland Railway abolished second-class carriages and upgraded their thirds to replace them. All of this was a bit of a headache for other railway companies who had to keep up. Well, except for the Glasgow and South Western Railway, which never had second class to begin with. I've jumped ahead here, but all this is to say that if St Pancras was to get a hotel, it was to be the swankiest hotel on any station in London. The company held a competition to decide the designer, and the architect who won was George Gilbert Scott, probably the closest thing Britain had to a celebrity architect at the time. Scott was a deeply religious man, and he was well known for his work on churches, so it's perhaps no surprise that he became the best-known practitioner of the Gothic revival style. He worked both in Britain and abroad, so he drew his influence not only from homegrown buildings, but those in Europe. Now, there is a popular story that Scott simply recycled a rejected design for the Foreign Office, and that's what we have at St Pancras, but that's not exactly true. It is true that Scott submitted a design in his secular Gothic style for the Foreign Office back in 1858, and that it was rejected. In fact, he kept pushing this design for 2 years, but eventually was forced to give the government something in the neoclassical style. So the Midland Grand was his chance to finally build something in his preferred style, on, as you might say, a grand scale. That being said, it wasn't quite as grand as he'd originally intended. The original idea was that St Pancras should become the new company headquarters, but between design and construction they changed their minds and remained in Derby. So a story was lopped off the design since the offices didn't need to be there. Construction began in 1868. The first part of the hotel opened in 1873, and it was finished in 1876. Despite instantly making a splash, Scott somewhat sniffily noted, "It is often spoken to me as the finest building in London. My own belief is that it is possibly too good for its purpose." The interior was just as spectacular, with marble and carved wood everywhere, vaulted ceilings, murals, plush carpeting, mirrored walls, sculptures, and up-to-the-minute facilities. However, this literally came at a price. It was more expensive to stay in than any other railway hotel, apart from the Great Northern next door, another one in the eye for King's Cross. Originally, the station itself had 2 platforms, with the rest of the space being filled in with carriage sidings. Obviously that would change as time went on. The trains calling here were expresses only. Commuter trains were sent down the Metropolitan Railway to Moorgate. The concept of commuter traffic was fairly new in the 1860s, and the Midland weren't that interested in dealing with it. Long-distance trains were where the money was. The prestige nature of the station and the railway is perhaps reflected in the fact that until 1924 it was the departure point for royal trains to Sandringham. From 1870, trains of the Great Eastern Railway were allowed into St Pancras. This was 5 years before that company's Liverpool Street terminus was opened. This was a trade-off. The Great Eastern controlled lines into the London Docklands, and the Midland Railway wanted in. They got a dock at Poplar. Although the depot is long gone, you can still see the Midland Railway's hydraulic pump house near to Blackwall DLR station. In 1894, St Pancras got its first international trains. Kind of. The Gospel Oak to Barking line opened that year, also known as the Goblin, or these days the Suffragette line of the Overground. This gave a connection to the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway, and that company operated boat trains between St Pancras and Tilbury. The Midland would buy the LTSR out in 1912, resulting in this bizarre situation where there was a Midland line in the southeast. Despite all this, St Pancras was a relatively quiet station by the standards of London termini, and that was simply because, while other railway companies embraced commuter trains, the Midland resisted for many years. In 1906, the Underground station opened, that of the Great Northern, Piccadilly and Brompton Railway, now the Piccadilly line. The following year it was joined by the City and South London Railway, now part of the Northern Line. The station served both King's Cross and St Pancras, as it does today, but it was simply called King's Cross. In 1927 it would be renamed King's Cross for St Pancras, and in 1933 King's Cross St Pancras. There was still no metropolitan station here, though. The First World War saw St Pancras fall victim to a bombing raid in 1918. Most of the 5 bombs dropped exploded without loss of life, but one fell in the cab road outside and killed 20 people who were waiting there. Another would destroy the booking hall roof, which was replaced with something rather plainer. The war resulted in a temporary change in the way the railways were run, effectively nationalising them for the duration of the conflict, and this ultimately led to the concept of the grouping. This was kind of a halfway house. Several railway companies at the time were running at a loss, but they were too big to fail. On the other hand, nationalisation was a bit radical for the government. The solution was to collect all the public railways together into what they called the Big Four in 1923. The Big Four were the Great Western Railway, the Southern Railway, the London and North Eastern Railway, and the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. The Midland Railway fell under the LMS. So too did the London and North Western Railway. Now the LMS had 3 major termini in London: Broad Street, Euston and St Pancras. Actually, back in 1921, the London Society proposed going even further, closing King's Cross and St Pancras and diverting all traffic into Euston. Given how crowded Euston is today, I think we can all be very grateful that that recommendation was ignored. But that's not to say that there were no consequences for St Pancras. The former Midland Railway would have a massive influence on the LMS. Some historians even describe it as the Midland absorbing the other railways. But this meant that trains from St Pancras were no longer in competition with those from Euston for the cities of the north. There was no longer the speed versus luxury contest the old companies had had. The real competition in grouping days was with the London and North Eastern Railway's Marylebone for the cities of the Midlands, but the company didn't seem that bothered by this. Certainly it doesn't seem to have affected the timetabling or luxury standards of their trains. The hotel, too, had dropped in the company's priorities. The perception of it had changed over the decades. It was a top-tier hotel in the 1870s. By the 1880s, it was considered an excellent hotel for the price. In 1892, James Allport would pass away in the hotel, a company man to the end. In 1897, George Gilbert Scott's son, George Gilbert Scott Jr., would also pass away as a result of cirrhosis induced by alcoholism. His son, Giles Gilbert Scott, is probably most famous for designing the iconic red phone box, which, legend has it, was inspired by the tomb of Sir John Soane at St Pancras Old Church. Not directly relevant, I just thought it was an interesting connection. Anyway, the company had trouble keeping the hotel up to date. It was so solidly built that it was impossible to carry out major renovations. By the 1930s, compared to other hotels, it was not making much money. So in 1935 it was closed and converted into what might have been the grandest office block in London, under the uninspired name of St Pancras Chambers. And those magnificent interiors were reserved for the company servants of the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. In 1941, the Metropolitan line finally came to St Pancras. Originally there had been a separate station at King's Cross. However, with the Underground coming under the control of London Transport in 1933, there was a concerted effort to make the hitherto rather disparate and often illogical Underground system make sense. Part of this involved moving King's Cross Metropolitan line station closer to the Piccadilly and Northern line. As it happened, when St Pancras had first been built, the tunnels to the Metropolitan had been built wider than necessary, in anticipation of traffic increasing. That meant that there was a convenient place to put new platforms. And just as well, the old station was hit by a bomb in 1940. Anyway, the Metropolitan platforms are also the platforms for the Circle Line and, since 1990, the Hammersmith and City Line. As for St Pancras, the main line station, it was bombed 5 times during the Second World War and the booking hall had lost its roof again. Meanwhile, changes were afoot for the now rather shabby and run-down terminus. In 1943, plans were being made to totally rebuild London. It wasn't just St Pancras. Vast areas of the city had been bombed heavily, and serious consideration was being given to the idea of just starting over. The ideas were published in 1946 in the County of London Plan. This recommended closing St Pancras and diverting everything to Euston again, with only the Underground station remaining. In 1948, a behind-the-scenes change took place. The railways were nationalised. The London, Midland and Scottish Railway became the London Midland region of British Railways. In the meantime, the County of London chaps seem to have cooled down a bit. In 1951, the development plan for the County of London recommended that far from being closed, the station should be overhauled. As I said earlier, the commuter service from St Pancras was not a priority when the station was built, and by the 1950s it was still pretty dreadful. Something had to be done, and it was recommended that the commuter lines should be electrified. That would happen, but not for a while. Instead, diesel trains were introduced in 1960. For the commuter services, diesel multiple units. These had a quick turnaround compared to steam trains, even if they weren't quite up there with electric trains for speed. That same year saw the introduction of the Midland Pullman. This was a callback to the station's prestige era. It was a distinctive blue diesel train that provided luxury accommodation for passengers to Manchester. It only operated for 6 years, but the Blue Pullman, as it was commonly known, would provide the model for later long-distance diesel trains with its locomotive at each end. These upgrades to the train service were matched with an upgrade to the station facilities. Yet it was clear by the 1960s that the glory days were over. In the opinion of many, not least Transport Minister Ernest Marples, so too were those of the railways. But then, as a former managing director of a road building company, he would say that, wouldn't he? Still, the government had this idea that the railway network should be made to pay, and the best way to do that was to get rid of everything that did not, in itself, make a profit. The infamous Dr. Richard Beeching was brought in to decide which cuts should be made. One of his reports from 1965 implied that the line into St Pancras might be on the chopping block in the long term. British Railways walked this back. In August 1966 they announced that while the Midland Main Line was safe, it didn't really make much sense to have St Pancras and King's Cross so close together. In a proposal that would have had James Allport spinning in his grave, they announced that they would be amalgamating the two stations. St Pancras would be for the demolition ball. The outcry was instantaneous. In the 1920s and 30s there had been a reaction against the work of George Gilbert Scott and other Gothic revival architects. Their work was considered ugly and tasteless and unnecessarily fancy. But tastes change, and London was still reeling from an earlier demolition. When Euston Station had first been built, it had been fronted with a magnificent Doric propylaeum, a gateway to the north. It had been London's first intercity station. A great hall had been added in 1849. It was a spectacular station for sure, but not a spacious one. When British Railways announced plans to electrify the old LNWR route, they stated that the old Euston would have to go. Between 1961 and 1962 the station was demolished. Reconstruction was still going on in 1966. The destruction had been enormously and unexpectedly controversial, raising objections from such figures as the Earl of Euston, the historian Nicolaus Pevensey, and the poet John Betjeman, whose statue stands in St Pancras today. The controversy continues to this day, particularly given the present-day shortcomings of the replacement Euston Station. So when it was announced that BR planned to do the same to St Pancras, you can bet a stink was kicked up. Historians and architects alike protested the proposal, and Professor Pevensey once again argued eloquently for the retention of the old building. British Railways modified their plans. Maybe, instead of knocking it down, they could turn it into an exhibition centre or a sports facility. Commuters argued that shabby though the station might have been, it was a perfectly decent station with a perfectly decent service. At least with Euston, it could be argued that the space was needed. In 1967, while British Railways were twiddling their thumbs and pondering what should be done, the Ministry of Housing had the whole thing listed. Grade 1, putting it on a par with the Houses of Parliament and St Paul's Cathedral. And in 1968, British Railways declared that they would not be diverting the train service to King's Cross after all. Actually, not only would St Pancras not be losing a train service, it actually gained one. December that year would see the opening of the Victoria line of the Underground, the first completely new tube line in over 60 years. In 1969, a one-off international service departed from St Pancras Goods Yard. The Daily Mail organised an air race from London to New York. Tom Lecky Thompson won the race in a Hawker Siddeley Harrier, which took off from the largely abandoned goods yard on the 4th of May and managed the trip in 6 hours 11 minutes. This is that jet, by the way. It's preserved at Brooklands. Unfortunately, the jet exhaust blasted years' worth of coal dust all over the VIPs in attendance. I haven't talked much about the goods yard, perhaps a consequence of the fact that it was not exactly the most glamorous nor the most controversial part of the station. But the fact of the matter was that by the late 1960s it was basically disused. Road haulage had taken the bulk of the goods traffic that had once come here, and the rest was sent to larger, more modern yards. In fact, the one at King's Cross was one of these for a while. In 1975, BR relinquished the goods facilities. There are still some remains of the goods yard to be seen, but much of it now lies beneath blocks of flats, the British Library, and the Francis Crick Institute. The electrification that had been recommended back in 1951 was finally carried out in 1983 as far as Bedford, resulting in an upgraded service from Bedford to St Pancras that would gain the unfortunate nickname of the Bedpan. Flush with success, British Rail, as it was known by now, started making other plans to upgrade commuter services in London. One of these would be known as Thameslink. This was a cross-London service that would use the connection to the Metropolitan Railway from St Pancras, then run along old Metropolitan tracks to Moorgate. Meanwhile, the old Snow Hill Tunnel from Farringdon to Blackfriars would be reopened, enabling a north-to-south service that hadn't existed since the First World War. All this is to say that on the Thameslink service, the Bedpan service would be bypassing the Pan. The first Thameslink trains ran in 1988. Which meant that not long after St Pancras had gained its upgraded commuter services, it would lose them again. In 1985, that George Gilbert Scott office block that had once been one of the grandest hotels in London was declared unsafe, and so it was taken out of use. The old decorations were sealed behind plywood screens. All this raised the question, what was St Pancras for? It had a fraction of the traffic that other termini had. There were no prestige expresses, no freight trains full of beer barrels, not even fast commuter trains. The buildings would see some use as a filming location. The goods depot would be Unit HQ in the Doctor Who serial Spearhead from Space. The abandoned Midland Grand would show up in the Spice Girls video for Wannabe, and the frontage would stand in for King's Cross in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, because evidently King's Cross itself was insufficiently magical. But all this only serves to demonstrate that the station just wasn't that important in the grand scheme of things. They could afford to close bits of it off without consequence. But that would change in the following century. In 1994, the Channel Tunnel was inaugurated, allowing people to take a train from Britain to continental Europe without messing around in boats. This had been decades in the making. Originally, back in the 70s, the plan had been to build a dedicated international terminus, probably at White City. But that didn't happen, and instead, the Eurostars got a set of platforms off to the side at Waterloo. This was an inelegant solution to the problem. The trains had to share track with ordinary services in the southeast, and there were a lot of those. The Eurostars in Britain gained a reputation for being slow. Before Waterloo International had even opened, something better was under consideration. A new railway line was to be built, known as the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, or as it would come to be known when it was complete, High Speed 1. This would, as the latter name suggests, be Britain's first purpose-built, modern, high-speed railway. British Rail proposed that this should approach London from the southeast. The engineering firm of Ove Arup and Partners thought something more radical was in order. Instead of going into Waterloo, they suggested swinging around London to the east and terminating in the north. The government were all ears, particularly Michael Heseltine, head of the London Docklands Development Corporation. Running a new railway through East London could potentially bring a source of regeneration to the derelict Docklands. Initially, the favoured terminus was King's Cross, specifically the old goods depot. The railway no longer had any use for this, and it had been colonised by artists and ravers. It was a large site, but the ground conditions were not ideal. A lot of work would need to be done to make it strong enough to support such a heavily used station. But what about St Pancras? The location was good, there was plenty of space, and importantly, it was already a railway station. But it offered other advantages too. An entire mothballed luxury hotel was a tantalising prospect. So too was the fact that it was on the main road. So too was the vast empty Undercroft. Norman Foster's firm of architects was engaged. The basic plan was that international trains would use the existing station and a new modern set of platforms would be added onto the side for domestic train services to South East England. Meanwhile, Thameslink services would now get a below-ground set of platforms to replace King's Cross Thameslink station. King's Cross Thameslink, incidentally, was located where the old Metropolitan line station had been, so history was kind of repeating itself here. With such a famous, and as they had discovered in the 1960s, beloved building, much consideration had to be given to how to convert the station with sensitivity to the existing fabric, but without compromising its function. International stations en route to the south coast had a tendency to evoke airport departure lounges. Both the architects and the rail authorities were keen that St Pancras should remain a station in the old style, a grand entrance to London, and so St Pancras underwent the biggest alteration since the 1860s. The old cellars were opened up and fitted out with shops, cafes, toilets, an international check-in, and entrances to the Tube and the Thameslink. New platforms in a modern style were stuck on. Fosters were of the opinion that since the original design was fairly asymmetrical, they shouldn't be beholden to recreating the Gothic style. Many older features were reinstated. A replica of the original Midland railway clock hangs at one end, and Allport's favoured sky blue was restored on the shed. And, of course, the hotel was reopened. The revitalised station opened in 2007, officially under the somewhat cumbersome name of London St Pancras International. In 2009, the high-speed domestic services began. There may be further changes to come. High Speed 2 is currently under construction, and there was a proposal for a people mover or monorail running between St Pancras and the intended terminal at Euston, though nothing came of this. The British Library has begun a new development which includes space for a station on the proposed Crossrail 2 line, which would connect Euston, King's Cross and St Pancras together below ground. The Office of Rail Regulation announced earlier this year that other operators may be allowed to compete with Eurostar running into St Pancras. Any railway station has to change if it's to survive, and St Pancras has changed more than most. At the same time, though, it's been spared a total rebuild, like Cannon Street, Euston, or whatever they're threatening to do to Liverpool Street. Allport, Barlow and Scott would have no trouble recognising their old station, though what they'd make of the modern additions we can only speculate. I'd argue that it's set a standard for other station restorations. St Pancras is now larger and busier than ever before, and even after 160 years it looks like its story is far from over. But if there's one thing the history of this station can teach us, it's that the future is never certain. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. You may have noticed that it was somewhat longer than usual. That's for two reasons. Firstly, I've wanted to cover the history of St Pancras for years. I've been collecting footage since at least 2021. And secondly, this is this channel's 1000th video. So I thought I'd pull all the stops out for something really special. I'm probably not going to have a video this Friday because, frankly, after 1,000 videos, I'm exhausted. The next video is currently scheduled for Sunday. Anyway, if you did like this video, please do leave a like, share it if you want, subscribe if you'd like to see more. Today's main sources were the Midland Railway by C. Hamilton Ellis, London's Termini by Alan A. Jackson, St Pancras Station by Jack Simmons and Robert Thorne, St Pancras Station by Simon Bradley, St. Pancras International 150 Facts for 150 Years by HS1 Limited, The Transformation of St. Pancras Station by Alistair Lansley, Stuart Durrant, Alan Dyke, Bernard Gambrill and Roderick Shelton, and Work, The Building of the Channel Tunnel Rail Link by Stephen Bailey. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your always generous support. You are the sky blue paint to my iron roof. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.